class, it's Mr. Andrews here. I have a few things I wanted to go over regarding our research paper. You should be getting excited at this point, not because you're writing a research paper. I don't think anybody has been, but one of the things you should be excited about is this is the last step in that long process. Everything we worked on from the proposal to your thesis to your research question to this outline that we just recently finished, right? It's all been in the service of preparing for this. So this research paper is really where everything comes together, right? It is a whopper, so be prepared for this. I have tried to be a little flexible though. So the length is a little shorter than what I would normally ask for. I'm asking here for a 6 to 7 page paper based on your research. So two of the things that I want to do today. The first one is I want to go over some of the requirements and the instructions for that, so you have a clear sense of what is required. And then the second thing that I want to do is I want to go over how you can handle evidence, because if you have your outline done, you probably have a lot of evidence plotted out. And so the question is, what do we do to build around that and to take that evidence and all that information we've listed out and transform it into paragraphs, right? What are some strategies we can do to take that that outline and turn it into a paper, right? And that's what I recommend, by the way. Build around the outline. Why double your work, right? Make a copy of that outline and start building off of it. So I'm going to go over some tips for how to do that here in a second. But first, back to the instructions. So with the research paper, it's a 6 to 7 page paper, as you can see, right? And it's based on your research, it's based on your annotation, your outlining, all the things that you've been reading, right? So this paper should address your driving question through a well-developed thesis. In other words, whatever question you came up with, and you really want to keep coming back to that because it can be easy to forget, what was it that started this whole thing? Your paper should be answering that question. So one of the things you should do at this point, before you even get started with moving beyond the outline, right, is look back over what you have with your outline and ask, have I answered that driving question? Is there more research that I need to do? Because if there is, even if you have an outline in place, there's still an opportunity, even at this point, for you to go back into the research and ask, is there more information that I still need to add? Is there some unanswered element of the paper, right? At this stage, the expectation is that this is going to be well researched, right? That doesn't mean that you are relying on 1 or 2 sources, but that you are bringing in a lot of information from different places. Now, you were asked to have 10 sources for the paper. Do you need all 10? No. And one of the things I mentioned in a lot of conferences with you guys last week was that you didn't need to, right? There might be 1 or 2 sources that are just repeating what other sources say, or they just didn't have a lot of information that is helpful to you, right? So they may not play a big role. They may not even be mentioned. But on the other hand, a lot of students fall into the problem of sometimes over-relying on just 1 or 2 of their sources that they quote a lot, right? But what they end up doing is more or less just replicating what that person said, and they're not bringing together information from a lot of places. So one of the things I want to mention is that the expectation here is that it's well supported through research. And what that means is that you're bringing in research from a lot of places, okay? So you should be doing what we call synthesis, right? Bringing together ideas from different places and building them off of each other. So the purpose and goals of this essay have a lot to do with what you developed already, right? Are you trying to argue something? Are you trying to prove something? What are you trying to do, right? In most cases, you have a sense of that because it comes down to the question. What is the question asking? Is the question asking for you to understand something? Is the question that you came up with in your proposal asking you to create a solution to something? That ultimately decides what your goal is with this essay, right? But no matter what, you should be making some sort of argument. There is some sort of argument you're doing. Even if you're informing people, you're still making an argument because you're still trying to tell us what to think or how to interpret the information, what to think about that information. So, requirements, 6 to 7 pages, like I mentioned before. Absolutely no exceptions to this. In order to receive no penalties, no deductions off the top, right? You have to meet that requirement. Now, will I accept a paper that's 5 pages, 5.5 pages long? I will accept it. But it's worth noting that off the top, there's probably going to be some deductions because it's likely going to affect a lot of the factors in the rubric. Now, I will be going over the rubric in the next class. So if you have questions about that, you're welcome to see that video next time. I will tell you that you can already find the rubric under the assignment for this. So feel free to preview it yourself, right? But I can guarantee you that if you're coming in under 6 pages, you're not going to be meeting some areas of that rubric. And I can guarantee you that there's going to be deductions to your grade as a result. Now, 12-point Times New Roman, that's just a fairness thing. If you turn in if you turn in a paper that's 6 to 7 pages, but it's an 18-point Arial font, guess what? I'm going to open that up. I'm going to change the font to Times New Roman 12-point, and I'm going to see what the length is. So don't try to cheat me on fonts, guys. Really try to focus more on the content. This form here is just so that we're all working with the same tools, right? 1-inch margins all the way around. MLA and text citations are an absolute requirement. I don't really need to explain those. You guys are familiar with them. Make sure that you're using them. And this doesn't just apply to quotes or quick friendly PSA, that it does apply that even when you're paraphrasing information, that is, you're putting it in your own words, but it came from a source, you need to make sure you're citing that too, okay? Remember that your works cited page should be included, but it is not part of the final page count, okay? Now, here's the big news, right? This is worth 40% of your quarter 2 grade, meaning it is worth nearly half of the quarter 2. It is worth nearly a quarter of the entire semester's grade. This is the biggest paper by a long shot that we'll be doing this entire year. So it is imperative that you turn this in. Without this piece, it is quite possible that you could not pass the course. So you want to make sure that you're turning this in, okay? Now, you do need to turn it in by 5/17. That is when this sucker is due, okay? Late submissions, I will accept up until the 20th. It's worth noting. I know that's not a long window. That's only 3 days. But the 21st is our absolute last day. So in order for me to have time to grade it, that's the timeline we have to be on. Now, that's an introduction to the research paper, but some of you probably are still at the stage where either you are finishing or you have finished your outline and you're wondering, okay, where do I go from here? Like, how do I even begin to change this into a paper? Maybe not all of you have taken an outline and turned it into a paper. So here are some goals and some tips for how to take that evidence that you may have listed out in your outline and how to integrate it into your paper. So let's take a look here. So first off, you want to think about, how do I select the evidence, right? Maybe you already started handpicking and selecting evidence with your outline, but maybe you still need some more, right? So here's how to think about selecting that evidence first. It's best to not just look for evidence about your topic, but evidence that specifically is going to help to answer your question. So that's what we were doing with the synthesis matrix, right? We were focusing on what are some of the excuse me, guys. I had to sneeze there for a second. What are some of the specific pieces of information that can answer your question, right? So it's not just, oh, I'm just going to throw everything in there, right? Because even if you have a lot of information about your topic, right, if it doesn't seem to really matter or apply to your question about the topic, right, I'll be scratching my head saying, well, it's not really relevant. Is it relevant? So there are 2 steps that you really ought to do. You want to be choosy about what evidence you include, okay? If you're putting in a lot of fluff and filler, I've got a good radar for that, okay? And really, at the end of the day, it's not just about throwing information out there, right? I could do a quick Google search and find tons of information, not all of which is going to help answer the question. So this is where you come in. Your job is to filter all that information, right? And to really mindfully and purposefully decide what information is important. Because if you're just kind of taking whatever comes at you about your topic and just relaying it, right, you're not really doing the work of a researcher or a writer. Instead, you're just kind of being a middleman, right? And you don't want to do that. That's not really your goal here. So the first thing you want to do is begin with questions, right? If you did the outline, you've already done this step, right? But it's possible that maybe there are some remaining questions. Maybe you're finished with the outline, but you're going, oh, there's actually more questions I still need to answer. So use your research question to brainstorm that list of related questions. Maybe you came up with some for your synthesis matrix. Maybe you have them in your outline. But are there some other additional questions that you need to answer? Some still missing information that you need to go back to, right? All right. So pay attention to the details. In order to find evidence that is significant, you want to consider what details are most significant. So what that means is that you really don't just want to choose things that are about your specific question. You also want to choose the information that is most helpful in answering the question. So pre-think about details that would be most significant. If, for instance, your question was, to what extent are followers of, let's say, PewDiePie on social media actively engaged? How would you go about finding evidence for that? That's the thing you want to have in mind. It's like, if I'm thinking about my question, what kind of evidence would help to prove that, right? What details and features in the media might give us clues about their followers' engagement? So now I'm thinking about, what do I need to look for? What would be significant? Well, some things I would probably be looking for, right? We're talking about actively engaged, not just passively. When I think of active engagement, I'm thinking of people who are following someone and who are commenting. Maybe they're liking, but maybe they're retweeting, they're reposting, they're sharing a story, right? This is what it means to be active. They're doing more than just viewing it. It's not like he just has, 20 million views. He's also got a high number of likes. He's got a high number of responses, high number of retweets. That's what it means to be actively engaged. So I'm thinking now about what evidence would help to answer the question. That evidence is not only relevant, but it might be significant, right? So what would be the most significant details and features? That's what I want to do. With your question, it's the same thing. You want to be thinking about what information is most relevant, what information would be the most significant. So look for patterns in the details. If you look through your outline at what you've come up with so far, if you go back to the research and ask, are there repeated ideas? Are there trends that you see, right? That's what is most significant. Patterns are usually more significant than a one-time thing. Maybe you have one article that disagrees with all the others, but you've got 6 or 7 that agree, right? It's worth noting that those 6 or 7, they may not be correct just because they agree, but it is significant that 6 or 7 of them do, and that one is an outlier, right? That could be important in terms of what you decide to communicate and how you decide to communicate about your evidence. So what do we do now that we've selected our evidence, right? Maybe you have all your evidence in your outline, right? You decided, okay, I've got a bunch of really good, relevant, and significant stuff. What next? How do I turn this into a paragraph? Well, this is the step. You may have heard of this before. A lot of teachers will use this metaphor, but this is what we call the evidence sandwich, right? The evidence sandwich is, it kind of sounds elementary and basic, but honestly, it's just a great model. It's a great way of thinking about using evidence. So in all cases, we want to think of, in this case, in this metaphor, the evidence as being that filling, right? Now, I love fried chicken, and I love, all the stuff that goes inside of a sandwich. But let's face it, right? A piece of fried chicken with some condiments on top of a bed of lettuce is really just a weird kind of like mutant chicken salad, right? Or salad with some chicken on top. It's not a sandwich, though. A sandwich it does not make, right? So one thing we want to think about is, how do we kind of get it all into one unit? That is what we call the evidence sandwich. So we might think of the top bun here as being the setup. Now, the setup is some sort of lead-in. It would be really, really weird for you to just drop a quote on us in the middle of your paper without telling us anything about where it came from, what article it was written in, what the person was saying when they wrote it, right? If you just say, according to Richardson, blah, 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 well, those words according to Richardson mean nothing if the reader has no idea who Richardson is, if they have no idea what the article Richardson was writing about says, right? Without that setup, without that what we call context, it really is a meaningless statement to say according to Richardson, because most readers will probably scratch their head and go, why should I believe Richardson, right? And why is Richardson's thoughts even relevant to this? So maybe you decided while you were looking at evidence that this evidence was good and it was relevant and it helped to answer the question, but you need to provide in the setup, the top bun here, why to readers. You need to explain to readers why it mattered and why it was relevant, why it was significant, right? So when introducing evidence from a source for the first time, here's the recommendation, right? A good lead-in is to give readers important need-to-know information about the source. This means maybe a one-sentence summary, right? In an article that reviews, in an article analyzing the social media habits of popular YouTube celebrities, comma, Chad Andrews states that, right? Now we know from that sentence right there, that setup, that we're talking about an article about the social media habits of YouTube celebrities. Now I know why this article is relevant to analyzing PewDiePie, right? So giving us that need to know information, maybe telling us about the author of the information. This can help to build what we call ethos, right? Ethos is your credibility. So if you mentioned that Chad Andrews is a professor of social media communications, right? That might be a really important detail to note, especially when you're setting up this evidence and why the evidence is significant. And also, it might be important to look at the circumstances surrounding the evidence, right? This was an article written in 2019, so it's fairly recent. That kind of information, too, could be helpful to provide so that you can make that evidence much more compelling and much more relevant to what you're talking about. So, setup. Tell us why that information, the information you're about to tell us about, is important. Build the credibility from the get-go. That's what the setup does. So the second part then is the meat of the sandwich, right? The filling, the stuff that we all already have. It's the evidence, right? Now we talked about how to select that. You want to make sure that it's relevant. You want to make sure that it's significant. Now it's worth noting that this can be quoted or paraphrased, but you should cite either way. You can either put it in your own words or you can quote. My recommendation though, choose the parts that are only essential. Now here's the thing. I love a good burger and I love a lot of different things on them and toppings and all that. But if you threw everything that was in the kitchen in it, it would be really sloppy and it would go from really good to really bad, right? You want to be selective about what you put in a sandwich. And likewise with your evidence, you want to be selective about your evidence. And this means that if you have a quote that is like really great, but it turns out that only one of the sentences from that source is actually the great quote that you need, including an entire paragraph or 3 sentences from that source that lead into it or that come after it, right? You don't need to include all that. That's like adding a bunch of unnecessary ingredients or throwing anchovies on this beautiful chicken sandwich, right? Only quote the parts that are relevant. A lot of you may be tempted to add in these long quotes that are an entire paragraph long because you just want to fill the page. The reality is that's actually going to hurt you more than it's going to help you, because in the grading, I'm going to be looking at and going, they're really over relying on the author's words here. They're quoting entire paragraphs, but only one sentence of that quote actually mattered to their paper. So don't fill it in with a lot of fluff, guys. Only quote or paraphrase the parts that actually matter. If you add in all that extra information and you're not doing the work of doing your own lead in to it, it's going to be a deduction. It's not going to help your paper either. So make sure that you're only including the parts and be selective about what you include here, okay? Again, you don't want to throw everything in the kitchen on this chicken sandwich. Now, what does it mean to paraphrase versus quote? And when should you paraphrase versus quote, right? So here's a good example here. In this paraphrase, right, you want to use paraphrase when you want to quickly put ideas into your own words without losing meaning. Note, it would have taken a lot more time for the reader to read the original tweets that go back and forth, right? But here what this person did was they instead decided to summarize a bunch of information by paraphrasing. So if you're looking at a lot of information and you feel that quoting the author directly would actually take a lot longer, use your own form of summary by paraphrasing it. Put it in your own words, okay? If you weave, or if you decide you want to quote, that's fine. But again, be selective about how much you quote. Only use the part that's valuable. In this case, they've quoted, but you can see here they've actually used just part of a quote and threaded it into a sentence, right? So again, they chose the words that really mattered the most here. And you can see it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They've actually only quoted 5 words. And they used those 5 words specifically to make a point. So one thing you might consider is using partial quotes or choosing the words that matter the most and building your own sentence around it. This is going to make the evidence a lot more useful in the paper because You're doing the job of explaining and fitting it into your paper in a much more purposeful way. So last but not least, the bottom bun here. What is the bottom bun? That is the connection piece. So we set up the evidence first by leading into it. Why is it important? Why is it relevant? Why does it matter? Then we explained what the evidence was. Here's what the evidence is. But finally, what do? We stick the landing. We call this the connection. It's the bottom bun, the last piece here. So whenever we use evidence, we want to follow it up. You don't just want to give a quote. You don't want to just give a statistic or some information and then just walk away, right? According to the American Health Research, 95% of people who follow social media end up with depression. I don't know. I made that up, right? But let's say that that's something you came up with. If you just get that evidence and then you mic drop, walk away, right? What you've done is you've missed a golden opportunity to explain to readers instead of leaving them wondering why this matters, right? Now, readers might be able to figure it out. I mean, they're not dumb. They can probably figure out sometimes, and in some cases, how the evidence matters. But it really shouldn't be up to the reader to do that, right? You as the writer and the researcher, it's really your job to lead the horse to water here. So you should explain how your evidence supports and connects to your ideas, right? This evidence is significant because, or this evidence connects to or is related to, or this is important because. These are some really great sentence starters that you can use immediately following your evidence. So maybe this is where you explain that relevance, that significance. Why is it important? Now, in some cases, it may be very obvious, but it's still important that you follow up with that explanation and connect it back to what that evidence means. What are the consequences of that evidence? What does that evidence suggest for your answer to the question? So if we're looking at 3 different pieces here, let's put them all together, right? Let's say that we're researching the hashtag trend Ask Her More, right? Ask Her More was a hashtag trend revolving around superficial treatment of women, specifically in Hollywood, right? So in 2015, during the Oscars, there was a lot of hubbub, right, about women being asked superficial red carpet questions. Much more show at award shows, right? So here's the setup. Already in 2015, women protested superficial red carpet questions female actors are asked at award shows by using the hashtag Ask Her More. So what they've done is they've given us context, right? They gave us a situation so that we understood the evidence that's coming in. So the hashtag trended in the lead up to this year's Academy Awards, and red carpet reporters, including ABC's Robin Roberts, mentioned the hashtag on air during the show and asked actresses some of the more substantial questions suggested on Twitter. So this is information that would have been difficult, I think, to digest, right, to understand without this right here, without this setup, without this lead-in. Without that context, it actually would have been difficult for us to understand what was happening in this evidence. Connection. Now we're bringing it together. By grabbing the attention of the broadcast media, the hashtag Ask Her More campaign was effective in communicating their message to an audience beyond their usual social media followers. So in other words, now the writer here is trying to explain why this is significant, right? Not just that it happened. They're not just leaving it up to the reader to decide what to think of it. As a researcher writer, it's really your job to try and explain or make an argument about what the reader should think or understand from that evidence, right? Try to give them a point of view. And that's exactly what they do here. They interpret that information and they tell us, okay, the hashtag Ask Her More campaign was effective here because they were able to break into not just social media, but actually the mainstream media, right? Grabbing the attention of the broadcast media. So now they're telling us, okay, this is why it's significant. This is why that evidence matters. And this is what that evidence means. You want to lead the readers. Again, you want to think of yourself as a researcher, as a writer, as an arguer. You really are ultimately leading your readers and their thoughts. You should be doing that rather than leaving their room for interpreting it however they want, okay? If you wanted to do that, you would just tell them to search Google for it and kind of look at information and decide for themselves. But that's not the purpose here. Your purpose here is to make an argument and a case and an answer to your question. So that is some quick tips on how to take this evidence from your outline and turn it into fully formed, as you can see here, bits of or parts of paragraphs, right? Even just one piece of evidence has provided what, like a full six sentences right here. So every piece of evidence, if you're using this pattern for each piece of evidence, you're going to have plenty to say in this paper, right? If you're providing that lead-in with the setup, if you're providing a full explanation of the evidence itself, and if you're taking the time to connect it back to your point and explain why that evidence matters. So I hope this was helpful to you guys, and I wish you the best as you're getting started on this. Reminder that your first full draft is, your partial draft of 3 pages or more is due on the 12th. So do make sure that you're beginning to work on that. It is 3 pages or more. That is the next step in this process. Guys, I wish you the best, and I'll be talking to you soon.